Some people don't fall apart when their role changes. They don't panic when a title disappears. They don't feel lost when they step away from something that once defined them. And for many people watching from the outside, that calm is confusing. Because most people are raised to believe that who you are is tightly connected to what you do. Your job, your role in the family, your position in a relationship, your place in a social structure. So when someone doesn't cling to these things, it creates discomfort. Not because they are doing something wrong, but because they are doing something unfamiliar. This video is about the psychology of people who don't attach their identity to social roles, and why losing a role doesn't feel like losing themselves. The quiet rule most people live by. From a very early age, people are taught a silent rule. You are valued because of your role. The good student, the responsible sibling, the provider, the leader, the dependable one. At first, these labels feel harmless. They even feel encouraging. But over time, something subtle happens. The role stops being something you do and slowly becomes something you are. And once that happens, your identity is no longer internal. It's external. It depends on performance. It depends on recognition. It depends on staying useful. This is why role changes feel so destabilizing for many people. When the role disappears, the sense of self disappears with it. Why role loss feels like personal collapse. When identity is tied to a role, the role becomes emotional protection. It tells you where you belong. It tells you how you are seen. It tells you why you matter. So when that role is threatened by job loss, relationship changes, social rejection, or even simple irrelevance, the mind reacts as if the self is under attack. This is why some people feel empty after retirement, why some people feel invisible after divorce, why some people feel lost when they are no longer needed. They didn't lose a role. They lost the structure holding their identity together. But not everyone experiences this. The people who react differently. Some people go through the same changes and remain steady. They still feel stress. They still feel uncertainty. But they don't feel erased. They don't spiral into identity confusion. They don't scramble to replace the role immediately. They don't cling to labels for stability. This isn't emotional numbness. It's psychological organization. Their identity was never fully attached to the role in the first place. Internal identity versus role-based identity. Most people build identity from the outside inward. They learn who they are by watching how others respond to them. Praise strengthens identity. Criticism reshapes it. Repetition locks it in. Over time, the self becomes a reflection of social feedback. But some people develop identity differently. Their sense of self forms internally first. It's based on personal values, internal standards, self-defined meaning, inner consistency. Roles exist, but they don't dominate. These people don't think, I am this role. They think, I occupy this role. That distinction is everything. Why titles don't mean much to them. You may notice that these individuals rarely introduce themselves through titles. They don't lead with status. They don't emphasize hierarchy. They don't define themselves by position. They can perform the role fully and still step away from it cleanly. Because internally, the role was never carrying their identity. It was a function, not a foundation. Why change doesn't destroy them. When identity is internal, change feels different. Change feels like adjustment, not loss. They may feel uncertainty. They may feel pressure, but they don't feel hollow. Their core remains stable. That stability often gets misinterpreted. People assume they don't care, or that they are emotionally detached, or that they lack ambition. In reality, they are anchored somewhere deeper. Why this makes others uncomfortable. People who don't attach identity to roles unintentionally challenge others. Not through words, not through behavior, just through contrast. When someone watches another person walk away from a role without panic, it forces comparison, and comparison exposes fragility. Instead of curiosity, people project discomfort. They label, they distance, they misinterpret calm as coldness. But what's really happening is internal conflict, not evaluation. They don't need constant validation. When identity depends on roles, validation becomes necessary. Approval confirms worth. Recognition stabilizes self-image. Attention reinforces identity. But when identity is internal, validation becomes optional. Nice, but not essential. That's why these people often don't chase recognition, don't explain themselves repeatedly, don't panic when unnoticed, don't perform for approval. They already know who they are, and that knowledge reduces noise. Why they seem hard to read. Because their identity isn't role-driven, their behavior doesn't follow predictable scripts. They don't react how their role should react. They don't perform expected emotional patterns. They don't narrate themselves. This makes them difficult to categorize, and people tend to distrust what they can't categorize. So misunderstanding appears, not because they are unclear, but because they don't signal identity externally. They separate worth from usefulness. One of the most important psychological differences here is this: they don't confuse worth with usefulness. They can be productive without feeling superior. They can be unnecessary without feeling worthless. Most people are taught the opposite. If you're not needed, you don't matter. But people with internal identity don't operate from that belief. They matter regardless of function. That belief creates emotional stability others sense immediately. Why they don't over-attach to groups. Group identity provides structure for many people. Belonging offers clarity. Alignment offers safety. But for internally anchored individuals, groups are secondary. They may belong, but they don't dissolve into the group. They don't borrow identity from collective opinion. So when group dynamics change, they don't feel lost. They leave without emotional collapse. Not because they don't care, but because identity wasn't outsourced. This is not avoidance. It's important to clarify something. Not attaching identity to roles does not mean avoiding responsibility. These people still commit. They still show up. They still take roles seriously. But they don't allow roles to overwrite their internal compass. They integrate roles. They don't surrender to them. That balance reflects psychological maturity, not detachment. Why silence often accompanies this trait. People with internal identity don't feel the need to constantly assert who they are. They don't narrate their value. They don't announce their position. They don't explain themselves unless necessary. Silence feels safe to them, not because they are hiding, but because they are secure. And that silence often unsettles people who rely on external confirmation. When others feel threatened by their calm. There is a subtle social effect here. When someone doesn't cling to roles, others may feel replaceable. Because if identity isn't tied to position, position loses power. That destabilizes unspoken hierarchies. So resistance appears quietly. Distance, dismissal, subtle criticism. This isn't conflict, it's contrast. The freedom most people don't see. There is a quiet freedom that comes with internal identity. Freedom to change paths. Freedom to step back without shame. Freedom to redefine life without fear. Freedom to exist without performance. Most people never experience this freedom. Not because it's rare, but because it requires internal anchoring. And internal anchoring requires self-awareness most people avoid. Why they rarely feel lost. People whose identity depends on roles often feel lost during transitions. People with internal identity rarely do. They may feel uncertain, but they don't feel empty because the core remains intact. And that stability doesn't announce itself. It simply exists. Why labels don't matter to them. Labels help when identity is unclear. But when identity is internally defined, labels feel unnecessary. Not restrictive, not offensive, just irrelevant. They know who they are without naming it. And that quiet certainty is often misunderstood. The real difference. At the deepest level, the difference isn't personality. It's where identity lives, externally or internally. Roles support fragile identity. They become optional when identity is strong. People who don't attach identity to social roles aren't disconnected from life. They are connected to themselves first. If you've ever felt stable while others panicked, if roles felt temporary instead of defining, if silence felt safer than explanation, nothing is missing. Your identity was never outsourced. And that quiet strength is something most people only recognize after they lose what they built theirs on.